Yo, what up everybody, it's boy Goose, and welcome to the channel. In this video, we're going to talk about the Spooky Season Custom Yu-Gi-Oh deck. With Spooky Season at its peak, we wanted to make a deck commemorating some of the aspects and highlights of the season. From movies to the culture, there lies so many parts of history to be explored. Now, this deck is split into three categories: the spell and trap cards that have the effects when destroyed by your opponent, and the monsters, which are split into two categories: zombies and spellcaster types. Now, the zombies all have effects to discard themselves once per turn, and to have abilities when they're discarded to affect your opponent, depending on how many spooky monsters you control. And spellcaster monsters, where they have the ability to discard a zombie type monster as a cost when your opponent activates something so they can apply their effects. But one thing all the monsters have in common is when your opponent does something, they get to special summon themselves from the graveyard. Well, with all that being said, let's start with the cards. Now, starting out with our spell cards, we have the field spell Spooky Season. Now, when activated, you get to add one spooky monster from your deck to your hand, power up all spellcaster and zombie type monsters by 500 points. As a quick effect, discard one zombie type spooky monster, and when it's destroyed, you get to draw a card for each spooky monster you control. Next up is the Spooky Book of Horrors. Now, this card is a reference to the Goosebumps franchise, which is a children's horror book by R.L. Stine, which also has a Goosebumps movie following R.L. Stine's monsters escaping his books, forcing teens to recapture them before chaos spreads. Now, as a spell card, you can send one spooky monster from your deck to the graveyard, add one spooky spell or trap card from your deck to your hand, and if this card is destroyed by your opponent's card effect, you can special summon one spooky monster from your hand or deck in defense mode. Next up is our trap card, Spooky Swarm of Darkness. Now, by discarding a zombie or spellcaster type monster, spooky monsters you control are unaffected by your opponent's card effects. But when it's destroyed by your opponent's card effects, you can special summon a spooky monster from your graveyard or banishment in defense mode. By discarding a zombie or spellcaster monster, Spooky Dolls can make it only so you can special summon from the graveyard. If it's destroyed by your opponent, you can return one spooky spell or trap card from your graveyard to your hand. Starting our zombie monsters, we have Spooky Corpse Bride. Now, this card is a reference from the Tim Burton film Corpse Bride. That's about a man who accidentally marries a deceased bride in the underworld while seeking to return home. As a monster card, once it's discarded, you can banish one card from your opponent's graveyard for each spooky monster you control. When it's summoned from the hand, though, you can add one spooky spell or trap card from your deck to your hand, and when your opponent banishes the card, it can special summon itself from the graveyard. Spooky Leprechauns allows you to draw one card for each spooky monster you control, gain 500 life points once per turn, and when your opponent adds a card from their deck to their hand, they get to special summon themselves. Next up is the Spooky Pumpkin Prince. This card is a reference to Jack Skellington from Nightmare Before Christmas before Jack became king, like in the prequel book series Battle for Pumpkin King, that depicts the adventures of Jack Skellington and his rise to Pumpkin King. Now, as a monster, you can force your opponent to discard one card for each spooky monster you control. When a card is discarded, it can special summon itself from the graveyard, and once per turn, it's not destroyed by battle or card effects. Here we have Spooky Beetlejuice. This is a reference to the 1988 film Beetlejuice, where a recently deceased couple struggle to haunt their home and summons a mischievous ghost to scare away new occupants. As a monster card, he can destroy cards on the field up to the number of spooky monsters you control, power up your monsters by 300 attack and defense, and when a card is destroyed, he can special summon himself from the graveyard. Spooky Freddy Krueger refers to a fictional character of the similar name who haunts his victims in their dreams in the movie Nightmare on Elm Street. Similar to his effects from the movies, Spooky Freddy Krueger can special summon a monster from your opponent's graveyard, and when your opponent special summons the monsters from their graveyard, he gets to special summon himself from the graveyard. Also, when he attacks the defense position monster, he can inflict piercing damage. Next up, we have Spooky Ghoul Ghost. Now, this card is a reference to all the ghost movies out there like Casper and Ghostbusters. Now, this card's effect allows you to shuffle cards your opponent controls to the deck up to the number of spooky monsters you control, and when your opponent specially summons a monster from the hand of the deck, it summons itself from the graveyard. Next up, we have the Spooky Horseman, a reference to the Headless Horseman from the Legend of Sleepy Hollow. This character is said to terrorize the town's village while looking for his head. As a monster card, it can negate any spell or trap card by discarding a zombie type and halving its attack and defense. And when your opponent attacks, it can special summon itself from the graveyard and negate the attack. Closing out our spellcasters, we have Spooky Warlock. Now, this card can negate extra deck monster summons by discarding a zombie type monster. And when a monster is destroyed, it can special summon itself from the graveyard. Now, closing out the deck, we have our Spooky Dragon of the Witching Hour. Now, this card can burn your opponent for 500 life points for each spooky monster you control, negate a monster effect, and when your opponent specially summons a monster from the extra deck, it specially summons itself from the graveyard. And that about does it for this video. Comment down below your favorite card of the deck, which card should I add into the deck, and what franchise or season should I translate into your Yu-Gi-Oh deck next. Comment all of that down below. But with that being said, I'm sending positive vibes and kindness to everyone and keep things PG. Positively Goose. Bye guys.